Hello, everyone, and welcome today. My name is David Major. I am the chair of the photography department at the New York Film Academy, and I am very excited today to have Jason Florio as our guest speaker. I want to let you all know that on the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A button. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them in. I will come back after Jason's presentation and sort of moderate the Q&A. So your questions should potentially, or hopefully we'll get to all of them, but please feel free to use that during the presentation. I'd also like to introduce Nancy Burson, who is one of our faculty at the New York Film Academy. Nancy is an incredible artist in her own right, and she coordinates and organizes all of the guest lectures that we run through the photography department. And Nancy's going to come on and introduce Jason to all of you guys. So I will see you all back at the end of the presentation. Hi, Nancy, take it away.
Hi, everyone, and a special welcome, really a very special welcome to Jason Florio. I've been sharing Jason's work for many years now with students, and I have to say that I feel that his work truly embodies what it means to be an ambassador. He started in London and then spent 18 years in a rent control department in Greenwich Village, and then moved along with his wife Helen to Gambia, West Africa, which is where he is now. And Jason, we're so honored to have you. Thank you so much for being here. Take it.
Here we go. Hey Nancy, thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor. I feel like I'm back in New York for an hour. So great. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining. It's strange talking to myself, but I guess everybody's out there. So yeah, as Nancy said, I'm in Gambia in West Africa. It's the smallest country on the continent of Africa. It's very, very tiny, but it's been a sort of an on again, off again home for close to 22 years, actually, when I was an assistant back in New York. So what I thought I would do is I'd share some of my work over the last 20 years. It's kind of more project-based work. And I started off as an assistant in New York. I worked with a lot of fashion photographers and a lot of portrait photographers. And during that time, I was thinking about more into documentary photography. I had no idea how to get into it. But a chance encounter with a great Brazilian journalist, he said, look, if you're really interested in getting out of sort of fashion and kind of New York life, let's go to Afghanistan. So it was a trial by fire. So in 2000, we literally put on backpacks and walked across the border into Afghanistan. And it was controlled by the Taliban at that time, and photography had basically been outlawed. It was one of the Islamic tenets that there'd be no pictorialization of anything living. So the job became extremely difficult, but it was an amazing introduction to working in difficult conditions. And we ended up doing a 2-week journey, crossing the country. There was almost no other journalists there at the time. And when I got back to New York, very few people seemed interested in actually taking any of the work. But anyway, I sort of parked it. And then a year later, back in August of 2000, we decided to go back to Afghanistan and just see if anything had particularly changed. But we had the opportunity to spend some time with Amir Shah Massoud, who was this very famous anti-Taliban commander. And it was one of a small sort of enclave of people that were working and fighting against the Taliban. But life was extremely, extremely difficult, as you can imagine. And I think, kind of all eyes and ears are on Afghanistan with the proposed pullout. And I think it's very frightening for any of us who've kind of spent time in there and have spent time with the Taliban as well, to think that there could be a chance of the country falling back under their draconian control. this image is actually one of my favorite ones I took in Kabul during my first trip there, and we're invited into a house, and the owner of the house, these were his three daughters, and he was an Hazara, which had been heavily persecuted by the Taliban. And to me, this picture kind of... Oh,
Jason, sorry to interrupt. I just want to remind you, hit the share screen button so that we can, because right now we're not seeing the pictures you're talking about.
Oh, you're not. I am so sorry. Okay, let me go back. Hold on. I apologize, people. I've been scrolling through stuff, and it's how's that?
Not yet. Still.
Not yet. Hang on. Okay.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, let me do. I only went through a few images, but I'll go back through these and get back to the place I was talking about. I apologize, guys. Just hearing me rabbit and not seeing any pictures. So, as I was saying, the last picture which I was showing, which no one saw, was shot in Kabul, and to me it kind of summed up the situation. You know, the girls were obviously forcibly covered when they went out, but the two parts of the image was this clock which was turned sideways. It was almost like a nod to things that just were not working correctly in Afghanistan. It's almost time had gone backwards to some sort of medieval mindset. And the little fluffy pink cat, that picture under Taliban was actually illegal to have. Like I said, any pictorialization of anything that was living was outlawed. But within that, there was certainly kind of resistance happening. And even though schools had been outlawed in most of the country, we were invited into a secret homeschool for girls in Herat. So people were really putting themselves on the line to get the girls educated. And this was from the second year. And again, there's sort of things within the image that's just so representative of Afghanistan. You know, the boys having great fun, but it's with an old deflated football, making the most of the little that they had. I'd love to talk about every single image because they have so much meaning to me. But I realize we've got a lot to get through. So these were some nomads that we met along the way, pretty much subsisting on tea and on a bit of sugar and some bread. And this is, we were invited to spend a few nights with some nomads, and that to me was just such a powerful experience. These people were, again, they had been persecuted by the Taliban. A lot of their roots, you know, the roots that they'd taken for probably hundreds of years had all been disrupted because of the fighting and because of landmines. And they were basically living on this kind of lunar landscape when we went to see them. And this is the famous Amishar Masood, who was fought against the Russians, and he was fighting against the Taliban. He was a very charismatic character. And this photograph was taken on August the 9th, 2001. And literally 1 month later, Masood was assassinated by some Al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists. Masood was very sort of savvy, and he was very welcoming of foreign journalists, and unfortunately it was what got him killed. And I just got back to New York, and yeah, kind of the worlds collided at that point. September the 11th, let me just jump back a sec. I got back to New York, and again I had very little interest in the pictures. You know, people's mind weren't particularly on Afghanistan. But obviously 2 days later, September 11th happened right on my doorstep. And suddenly the pictures became of value. And like the shot of Masood, I think, is potentially one of the last photographs made of Masood. That's what I've been told anyway. And so it's very strange when you go to a country to, say, maybe go to where you think there's going to be conflict and you don't really find much going on, and then you get back and suddenly the conflict is right there on your own doorstep. And I think this is something that's it constantly resonates. Whenever I go back to New York and I'm stood on 6th Avenue near my old apartment, I look down there and it's, you know, suddenly the memories are flooding back. I think for all of us who were in New York at that time, it's indelibly etched into our minds. So when I was working as an assistant back in the late 1990s, I had an invite to go to come here to Gambia. And I'd never been to Africa before. And a friend of mine said, like, I've got an eco lodge project I'm doing out in the bush, and why don't you get out of New York for a while and just sit in the bush for a bit and decompress. So I got on a plane. I had no idea what I was coming to. To me, Africa was obviously, you know, kind of everything I'd seen in Oxfam advertisements of flies on children or wildlife programs. But anyway, here's where I am right now, that little tiny slither of a country, the Gambia. And this was a place for me during my early days as an assistant to kind of escape and start trying to work on my own projects. And I went with an 8x10 Deardorff field camera. Obviously, it was kind of pre-digital. And I've been really, the photographer I was working with was called Max Vadukel, and Max was kind of a New Yorker photographer doing fashion and portraiture, and Max had been working with the Deardorff, and a friend of mine back in Texas had one, and he let me use it. And so I took it to Africa, and I just started to make portraits of the people that lived around this sacred forest where my friends were doing a reforestation program and starting to build an eco camp. So the pictures were, you know, it's very sort of slow photography, as anyone who's worked with an 8x10 knows. Some of them I did with a Pentax 6x7 for all the people who want the techie stuff. It was shot on Tri-X. But I ended up doing this project over 10 years. It was just something I didn't really see a beginning. I saw a beginning, but I didn't necessarily see an end. I just loved coming out there and, you know, working slowly. I'd ride around the bush on a motorcycle with my 8x10 Deardorff and just kind of set it up with anyone that was willing to sit still for a few minutes and let me take a portrait of them. And just a little bit about this background cloth you might be wondering about. So the cloth, in some cases it appears totally black. In other cases it's a little bit kind of sheer, which you see in this final one here. It was a cloth that was given to me by my grandmother, and she used it in London during World War II, when the German bombers were trying to target London. People would put these black curtains in their windows to block any light out from inside the houses. And so this cloth is, you know, 70 plus years old. This was the first project I've used it on, and then I continued kind of over the years to use it on and off. So from working on the project around the forest, like I said, that went on for about 10 years. When my wife Helen and I got together, I actually met her in Gambia. It was 2008, 2009, and the economy, as many of my photographer friends in New York will attest to, was really down the pan. Editorial assignments were drying up, and we were all kind of scrambling and trying to find ways to keep working. And Helen and I have been sort of chatting about trying to come up with a personal project of some sorts and how to fund it. And Helen came up with this insane idea to walk around the Gambia. So at that point, I'd pretty much spent 10 years almost on all my trips there just being in the Makasutu forest and didn't really venture out that much. So I'd seen very, very little of the country. So the idea of walking about 1,000 kilometers around the country sounded slightly mad, but it seemed like a really good way to actually learn about the country. And so this is Gambia. It looks kind of like an intestine. If I show you the full map, it sits basically inside Senegal, and they often refer to it as the carrot in the face of Senegal. But the country, thankfully, is very flat, and it lends itself to walking. So the idea was we would sort of set off on foot with a donkey cart to carry equipment. And the idea was we would just sort of sleep wherever we could along the way. So we took 3 Gambians with us. One had been formerly in the military. The other one had worked in agriculture and knew the country very, very well. And the other one was our resident stoner donkey cart, donkey handler. And so we first thought we'll just kind of, we'll walk as far as we can each day and just sort of set up in the bush somewhere and sleep. But our friends, the agriculturalists, said we just can't do that. You need to present yourself to the village, go to the chief, and that will ask for kind of protection for him to sleep the night in the village, which is a very traditional way of traveling. If you read any of the old history books, then you always have to sort of go under the protection of the local chiefs. So I thought what we'd do is just I'd work in the same way, kind of maybe get the good old black background out again and do portraits. But I felt it was going to be more of a reportage project. But actually, once we had met the chiefs, we realized that the thread of the story was actually making portraits of them, because even though the chiefs, these traditional leaders, are they're still very strong in Gambia. As the country's modernizing, it was sort of a question how long they would actually be able to maintain that kind of local power. And one of the things as travelers that you do when you arrive at a village and you meet a chief and you explain your mission to him is to hand over these cola nuts, which you can see in the picture here. It's a very traditional gift, and it's called Silafundo, which basically kind of means a gift on behalf of my journey. And what we decided to do as well is we'd ask them to sit for an official portrait, and then we'd have our own kind of form of Silafundo, which would be to make an instant print for them. So we carried a little battery-powered printer, which was attached to a car battery on the donkey cart. So after we made the portrait, then we'd make one for them. And that's one of the chiefs there with his portrait. And I think if this is going to work, I've got a very quick video. It's we did this project about 11 years ago, so the video quality is not fabulous, but it'll give you kind of a sense of maybe being there. Let's see if I can make this play. There we go.
Samba, just it doesn't have to be a long, just ask, just to get down the path. To make a long line down. More. Okay, back down. I'm gonna tell him I'll make a print. Let me just do one. Beautiful. Barakabake. That's really nice. Barakabake. So this is the Alcalo stamp. So it's Tambakunda, and it's part of Kalaji. And this is the original village. So the original original house and the original one here.
And it's in the Foni Jarol.
Foni Jarol. Okay. So this is the last part of the Fonis. Once we leave here, we head into Kiang.
Yeah, after here,
Barakabake chief.
Okay, so I'm glad that worked. So here's the portraits we made of him, and here's the stamp. So this was a really good little thing to have, because as we went to each village, we were able to show the new chief that we'd come through the previous village and it definitely sort of helped our ease of passage as we went around the country and sort of collected all the stamps. It was also just proof that we had made the journey, just in case anyone was questioning that we'd actually could have done it all from a hotel somewhere. And just a quick thing, as I was saying before, you know, the economy in New York was dreadful at the time, so we had to figure a way to fund this project. And what we did was we decided to do a pre-sale of prints, and this was before any of the sort of the crowdfunding sites that were which came about within a couple of years afterwards. And so we basically sort of reached out to friends and family, asking for, you know, donations in exchange for getting a print at the end of the project. Obviously, they had no idea what they were going to get, so it was definitely an act of faith. But it gave us just enough money to do the project. So you move on. These are some of the portraits we made. I think we made about 50, right? So Helen is with me just for backup. And so this is again using the 70-year-old World War II blackout curtain. So these are a mixture of chiefs and village elders who are you know, extremely important figures within Gambian society. This is something we didn't know that we would actually find along the way, are female chiefs. And at that time, there was actually five female chiefs, which I was very pleasantly surprised to find. And they were extremely gracious hosts. And this lady in the picture, her name's Fatu Dansu. She's not just a village chief, but she's also a very important figure in the fight against female genital mutilation in Gambia. And I think this, I mean, they're all my favorites. I shouldn't say that, they're all my babies, but this one I particularly love because it was a tiny village. I think it probably had only about 6 households in it. But the chief was extremely elegant, and he found the skin that he wanted to sit on the bench. But he was also a very funny guy, and there was a young lady there who was probably maybe about 20 years old, and he kept telling me it was his wife. And it turned out to be his son's wife at the end. And so the chicken rushing through the background was the frame that I kept, because it kind of to me was like a bit of an acknowledgement to his great sense of humor. But maybe I'm reading too much into it. So. The radio was just one of the village chiefs. He was just walking around at the end of the day, checking on his cattle, but he was listening to the Islamic prayers on his radio. So that's why I asked him to keep his radio for the picture. And just on a technical side, none of these are. It's all natural light. Some I used just like a little reflector on there, but most of them were shot kind of near the end of the day. And we tried to, kind of place the background somewhere. It just gave a bit of a hint of life beyond, but also, kind of the cloth became kind of a link, kind of a visual link as well. And I think this is the only horizontal one, so I'll leave that one there. So after doing this 930 kilometer 6-week walk around, Helen and I kind of got back and thought, and my friends at Makasutu, at the Eco Lodge and the forest conservation area, had some canoes, and over the 10 years, tributaries of River Gambia, And I said to them, it'd be great to paddle the River Gambia. I wonder if anyone's done it. And they said, well, you realize that River Gambia doesn't actually start in the Gambia. It starts in the highlands of Guinea, which is about 1,000 kilometers away. So I kind of parked the idea until Helen and I actually got together, and after we did the walk, we thought, well, maybe the next expedition would be something to do with the river. And when I started doing the research on it, I found that there was a project to dam the river, which would mean it would be one of the last major free-flowing, uninterrupted rivers in Africa. So we thought, we've got to do this before the river has this barrage across it, and it will obviously change the natural flow of the river. So we kind of figured we'd have to do it the same way, to do the same kind of funding, and a lot of the people who'd supported us on the walking expedition came through and supported us with the river expedition. Obviously, this was a lot more tricky because walking's one thing on flat ground, but dealing with a very large river that's got lots of hippos in it and crocodiles and rapids and all sorts of things, we didn't really know exactly what we were up to. So we engaged one of my oldest friends, a guy called Abdul Karim. If you remember the black and white picture of the man holding the crocodile, that's Abdul. So I won't bore you with all the planning details, but we ended up with 2 canoes, our 2 Gambian friends, and about 1,000 kilometers of river in front of us. And there's Helen, so you'll actually get to see her. So the idea was to go to the source of River Gambia, which is up in the highlands of Guinea. So we went by road up to the source, and it's in these beautiful highlands. And one of the things about it, we didn't know exactly where the source was. So Helen was doing research at the Royal Geographical Society in London and came across a diary of a Frenchman called Gaspard Molien. And back in the early 1800s, he was the first Westerner to go to the source of River Gambia. So we actually used his diary as a way to find where the source was. And I remember sitting with the book. I actually had it on my iPad, which seemed sort of, I wish I'd had a printed copy of it, but we couldn't find one. And kind of reading his notes and his description of where the source of the river is was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it's a sort of a surreal moment to be almost, sort of 150, 180 years later, reading the words of a Frenchman and looking down on the same spot. And so this is actually the very source of River Gambia. It's protected by the village. It's considered incredible that this, the giant river ends up at the mouth of River Gambia is next to the capital, Banjul. Here, it's just a stone's throw from where I'm sitting right now. This little trickle ends up breaking about kilometers wide. And I'm very concerned about time, but I guess I'll start working through these. So this is the idea of for the river journey was quite loose as far as what I was going to photograph. With the Silafundo project, with the walking of the Gambia and photographing the chiefs, we had a mission each day to make a portrait, and whatever else we got along the way was just kind of was a bonus. But with the river trip, we just didn't really know what we were going to find. And this was I think this is the picture I took on the very first day, and it was Helen had the binoculars. One of the things we were looking out for was hippos, and she said, "Oh, there's some white people down on the side of the river." And then as we got closer, she's like, "Oh no, it's not. There must be some kind of local ceremony," because we could see them painted up. We thought it was maybe a circumcision ceremony, one of the local traditions. But as we got closer, we realized they've all got numbers painted on them. So it was actually just a bunch of kids being kids, and they'd got their own little football team. And obviously they didn't have football jerseys, so they just painted the numbers on their chests. And so the idea was that we would paddle about, the whole journey by river is about 1,000 kilometers. And we would camp along the way. A lot of the villages are actually quite a distance from the river. So we'd often just have to kind of find clearings along the side of the river. In the early stages, there was a lot of sandbanks, and just finding just weird things along the way. These guys were punting. It was a very sort of Huckleberry Finn kind of moment. And these guys were punting a generator down the river. Let me move that. How's that? Okay. I think you guys might have been seeing a line across here, but let me see. Okay. Bear with me just for a second. How's that? Okay. Sorry if you've been seeing a line through these images that have just been pointed out to me. And this place is a very special place because it was, it's called Karantabar, and one of the early British explorers, a guy called Mungo Park, who's was a big kind of influence on our travels through West Africa, stayed here back in the very early 1800s. And this was kind of one of these, again, just sort of strange moments. We sort of woke up, got out from the tent, and there's guys swimming horses across the river. And so it was a mixture of kind of reportage and portraits. I did actually bring the black cloth with me, but I think I used it once and realized I had to break away from it. And yeah, the scenery was so interesting, and I didn't want to get kind of tied to something that had worked in the past, but it was better just to, I really wanted to be free with my photography on this journey. And this was Christmas Day. And I think we might have had some of that monkey in our Christmas dinner. We spent the night on the little boy came down from the village and presented a bowl of food with some mystery meat and kind of all back to the palace monkey that had been for the people's Christmas dinner. I think this was my favorite portrait from the whole journey. It was the son of a chief who had came down to see us off. We'd spent the night in rolling down fatherless fur coat. I think it sort of echoes back to my days as a fashion photographer. So the river, as you can see at this point, is getting quite wide. It starts off as a trickle, but as you get further to the coast, it really expands. And the early stages there's a lot of hippos in there, so that was a big concern of ours. And once we got to a sort of a certain point, Abdu, our kind of lead fisherman / guide, it was the area that he knew extremely well. And he basically said, look, once we get to a place called Kimoto Point, after that, the river's going to be, it's going to be the sea. And I said, what do you mean? We've got 100+ kilometers or more to go before we get to the sea. And he said, no, you're realizing it just opens up to a massive expanse. And we started at that point taking on water from the waves. It got quite frightening. So I'm just jumping back a bit here. Then these are not in sequence, but one of the things that we found along the way was that we documented some areas where there was a lot of things going on. We spent a few days, and this was an area of artisanal gold mining, which was an extraordinary place. There was just people, migrants coming from all over West Africa to try their luck in these local gold mines. And some of it's dug in holes, and others, other guys are actually dredging the sand out of the river to extract the gold. And this was a young boy that was working with his father at the gold mine. And there's something really just struck me about him, and it's a picture I often keep coming back to. But obviously, kids being kids, and this is local wrestling of kids mimicking some of the local wrestlers. It's a really big thing in this part of West Africa, and the wrestlers here are kind of like, they're really big superstars. And something which I'll touch on in the next project is about migration. And these young Gambian boys were telling us that they were collecting firewood so they could sustain themselves and their families, because they didn't want to go what's called the back way. And the back way is the irregular route to try and get to Europe. And Gambia, even though it's very small, has a very high percentage of migrants trying to get to Europe per capita. And these young boys were ones that wanted to stay behind and not make the journey. But Gambia is, I think probably within most families, or within even extended families, there's at least one or more people who have gone the back way, and a lot of people have died of making that journey, which I will come to shortly. This is River Gambia used to be a very important trade route. It was part of the slaving trade route. And it's also famous for haulage of peanuts, but the peanut traders kind of dropped off as far as moving it by river, and he was one of the last kind of rivermen. And just a lovely kind of little, one of those sort of strange moments, a little sort of beautiful thing happens in the middle of a little village. This was the night before we'd finished the expedition after being gone for 3 months. And she was almost just this little sort of elfin figure that just kind of appeared. And this is the end of the river. So that's how it looks from that little trickle. It ends up in this vast expanse. But we've just been told that the dam is now going ahead. So we're kind of intrigued to go back up to the area and take a look, and just see what sort of impact it's going to have on the villages, because there will be a number of villages that get flooded. It's going to affect wildlife in some of the national parks along the way. So we will be returning to River Gambia. I'm aware we're running short of time, so I'm going to skip this little video clip, and I'm going to, oh, maybe not. Okay, you're going to have a few minutes.
Jannem, go jannem. Yo. Ima e dulayo. Ayo jannem. Abadiada. Abadiada thing.
No. Float. Go at the mud. Mara, sampai jibe. Alfonso na sonda jibe dal kon. Tanya saja gua ka bodi le. Manda ko dai ni. Ke ko dai ni ko mu. Da du. Kere me jabano kame je tata. Kere me jabano kame je tata. Kere me tande amde sa sorry. Me kere me tande amde sa sorry. Me kere me wayo.
Ibu, bidau di nanam. Ah, tahu.
Okay, all right. That's, I guess the video wanted to have to be watched. So you'll see we're just shooting little video clips along the way. Some of them kind of mimic the still images. We didn't intend to do much with the video, but it just was more of a documentation for our own records. But anyway, it's nice to see it. And the voice you're hearing singing is Abdul, the fisherman. And he was singing these beautiful prayers as we were paddling along. So, as I was saying, the Gambia is a source country for migration, for people attempting to get to Europe. And in 2015, Helen and I were living in Gambia, and I got a phone call from an old friend of mine, Robert Pelton, who's a kind of an old war journalist, and he was working for an organization out of Malta, the island of Malta in the Mediterranean, and a multi-millionaire American had decided, he was so upset about hearing so many people dying at sea, people attempting to cross the Mediterranean from Libya to Europe, mainly to Italy, that he went out and he bought a boat and set up a whole rescue team with drones. And anyway, my friend Robert, who was working for them as a consultant, said, "Do you want to come out on a boat for a few weeks and document stuff for us?" So I headed to Malta, and I never really spent much time at sea, so I was very nervous. But it was absolutely life-changing. I ended up spending 18 months on and off the rescue boat, documenting multiple missions. And these are in no particular order. But it was profoundly life-changing, especially on the very first rescue that I was on. We had a group of Gambians, and the first little group I got talking to, there was a boy in there called Abdullah, and we had a brief conversation, and it turned out that he lived next to Makasutu, which was the sacred forest where I started doing my black and white portraits. And within a few minutes, I realized that he said to me, he said, "Oh, I have, my dad works at Makasutu." And I said, "Who's your dad?" And he said, my dad's name's Collie. And it turned out that I'd known his dad for years because of my time at Makasutu, and I'd actually photographed his dad. So suddenly, on this first mission, in the middle of the Mediterranean, I was confronted with what I'd been hearing about from people leaving Gambia to try and find a better life. And there was a person, one degree of separation from someone I knew. So I knew at that point I was immediately invested into continuing work. So Helen and I moved to Malta. We left Gambia. We moved to Malta. And for the next 18 months, as I said, I worked on the rescue boat. And within that time, I met a number of Gambians that I was closely connected to their families, including the nephew of my doctor here. So suddenly, the world really it just shrank, and it made me look at Gambia very differently when I got back. Because when I'd hear these stories about people leaving, going the back way, and there's been multiple families who've lost children or relatives by attempting this journey. And there was times when I would actually call back to Helen. Actually, for my first mission, Helen was still in Gambia, and saying about the young boy Abdullah that we rescued, I called Helen that night from our rescue boat back to Gambia, and I said, "You've got to call Collie. His son's here with me on the boat." And it took a few phone calls for Helen to actually convince Collie that what she was relaying was actually true, because they actually hadn't heard from Abdullah in a few months. They're concerned that he'd disappeared in Libya as the last time that they saw him. So over 18 months, it was just one rescue mission after another, and it was there was some great tragedies that we witnessed. Just great humanity as well, but just people not knowing what they were getting themselves into. Like this group, they were mainly they were Bangladeshis, and there was a Nepali. They had no idea that this boat that the smugglers had put them on would never get them to Europe. They were just seen as, I think the expression is face like dollar. And the smugglers were making millions and millions of dollars. Each one of these guys probably paid about $1,000 each to get on that boat. So you can do a quick calculation that these smugglers were making a fortune. A lot of the boats had, like this one had close to 400 plus people on it. It was a fishing boat built for about 10 people, but they would just absolutely pack them. When I first was doing the rescues, I was normally just on the inflatable boats that we were using as a go-between between the migrant boat and the rescue boat to ferry people onto our boat, because it was too dangerous to put the boats alongside each other. And after about 3 weeks, I realized I was just making the same pictures from the same perspectives. And Chris Catronbone, who was the founder of the organization, I think he sort of got a sense of that. And he said, "Okay, the next boat, I'm going to put you on it." And I said, "Okay, that's fine. I'll jump on there and I'll take a few pictures and you can pick me up after a couple of minutes." Well, what I didn't realize was I was on that first boat with this first boat I was on had 600 people on it. And I ended up being on there for about 5 hours until the boat was completely emptied of people. So the shot you're seeing here are people who are packed underneath the deck. I mean, they're literally, they've got no room to move. So if they need to pee or do anything, it's there. And this was the top deck of the boat, and with people just absolutely begging to be released, but we couldn't let people up until the top deck had been cleared because a number of these boats had tipped over, and hundreds of people would have drowned immediately from being stuck underneath. So I was able to get underneath, and this is pretty empty at this point. Normally, you couldn't even move. These were absolutely packed. It was filled with pee and vomit and just a stench of human beings who, they'd been at sea sometimes for a few days. And this was once people had been brought onto the rescue boat. I mean, absolute exhaustion and relief of being rescued. Some of them had been on their journeys for months, had been tortured in Libya. They'd seen just absolutely horrendous things. A lot of sexual abuse of women. People being murdered in front of them. It's every type of affront against human beings was meted out on them. This was a sort of a moment of when the guys I worked with on the rescue boat, they would often burn the boat that the migrants came on to stop the smugglers using them again. But the smugglers often were really brazen, and they would sometimes be circling the rescue as it was happening, waiting to be able to retrieve the boats so they could take them back and use them again. But this particular one, the rescue guys threw basically like a Molotov cocktail on there as the smugglers were on the boat, trying to get undo the motor, and the thing kind of burst into flames and the smugglers had to leap into the water. It was a little bit of sweet revenge in a way. Yeah, we documented a lot of abuses. This guy from Sudan had been severely beaten by the smugglers, and he said been using basically like a fan belt from a car, like a rubber belt. Part of the mission I worked on, we ended up also working in the Aegean. There was obviously a big migrant crisis in 2016 between Turkey and people trying to get from Turkey to Greece, and it was mainly Syrians and some Iraqis. We had some Afghans. The journey between Turkey and Greece was the distance was very short. It was only about, in some places, 10 or 12 kilometers. But the sea was absolutely, it could just turn, going from being absolutely gorgeous and blue to, just whipped up into a storm. And this was a boat that had, the engine had died on the boat, and one of these, he's a Syrian guy, and he'd seen our boat, but because it was dark, we didn't see their small boat bobbing around, and he and a friend jumped from their boat using rubber truck, the inner tubes, and started swimming towards our boat. And it was only by luck that the captain was maneuvering the boat against the wind, and the big searchlight saw these two guys in the blackness of the water, and we were able to rescue them and then locate the boat they came from. Other people weren't so lucky. This was some people that they came on a very small, fast boat driven by a smuggler, and the smuggler didn't realize he was very close to the rocks on the Greek side, and at the last minute turned and flipped the boat over, and there was 3 young children. There was 23 people on board, and 3 people died. And this was the smuggler. When we brought everyone on board the boat, it was only after a few hours that one of the Syrians said, the guy at the back is the smuggler. He's the guy that was driving the boat. So once the police arrived, they handcuffed him, and it's kind of a very strange thing, but they showed him the bodies of the 3 children that had died because of his actions. And it was a very sort of, I don't know, it seemed kind of medieval in some way, but I think they just wanted to make sure he understood what he had done. And so this picture is the coffin that they were going to put these three young children in, and the three bodies in the bags to the left. Okay, so this is the last project I'm going to show you, and it's a project that Helen and I have been working on for the last 4 years, and it's really sort of become extremely I don't know. It's been a very emotional project to work on. So, but just because we've been in Gambia for so long, and you have a very deep connection to the country and the people here. So just a brief bit of history. So the Gambia between 1994 and 2016 was ruled by a gentleman called Yahya Jammeh, who took over in a coup in 94. And over the next 22 years, the country sort of became more and more a dictatorship under his control. There was multiple disappearances. There was multiple human rights violations, and it sort of trickled down into the security services and beyond. So it became quite a tense place to live. The media took a heavy whack from him. Media houses were burned down, journalists were assassinated, tortured, disappeared, and anyone who basically sort of stood against him, including his own cousins, who were allegedly murdered on his commandos. So Jammeh left in January 2017, and at that point we started to photograph some of the victims of the regime who had been in hiding in Senegal across the border. And when the new president came in, this is Adama Barrow, it was the guy that's currently in power, that we realized we started to need to document all these stories of the victims and their families that hadn't been able to be told during Jammeh's time. And I think to this point we've made about 120 portraits and with accompanying video testimonies. And so it's a kind of an ongoing project, but it's been kind of extremely humbling to work on it. People have been very generous with their time, but we've been using the work as a kind of form of advocacy. It's currently for the last almost 2 years, we've had the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission, which is looking into all the crimes, the human rights abuses that happened during the Jammeh era. So people have been coming forward. It's every day on television, the testimonies, and on the radio. People have been absolutely hooked to it, because a lot of people just didn't realize what was going on in the background. People would hear of people disappearing and certain things happening, but it was never it wasn't so publicly known. So we've been photographing, from people that were, the journalists, obviously, people like this young girl, Lowe. Her father was killed. He was a soldier that was allegedly part of a coup in the mid-2000s. So she never actually really got to know her dad. She was very young at the time. And this is a photograph of her in her room, and with a picture of her dad, Lowe. So we always try to photograph people in a place that's comfortable for them, somewhere that's, how can I put it, that they have a direct relationship to. And obviously the home is kind of the most important place. Safe. And safe, yes, exactly. I won't go into all the stories, but for example, this gentleman here, he was part of a very, very brave group of people in 2016 that came to the streets. During Jammeh's time, there were almost no demonstrations. It was just too dangerous to speak out against the regime. But by 2016, people had had enough, and a group of mainly older people came to the streets to demand electoral reform. And they were dealt with absolutely brutally. This gentleman here, Ibrahim Jabang, who was a pharmacist, was in his 60s. He was tied to a table and beaten. The other people who were with him were tortured. And finally, there was a gentleman who was leading a protest called Solo Sendeng, and Solo was actually murdered by the authorities, which led to another demonstration a couple of days later to demand him, dead or alive. And at that point, I think it was one of the turning points that really opened people's eyes to Jammeh and the regime. And the election a few months later, turned against Jammeh after 22 years of him rigging elections. So this is a portrait of a guy called Mr. Tune, and his son, who was only 13 years old, was shot dead by the regime in 2000. There was a student protest, and like I said, there hadn't been any protest from 2000 until 2016. So there was a protest of students, and Jammeh's forces just opened fire on them. There was about 15 people killed, including a journalist and multiple young children, including this gentleman here is Abdul Karim. And Abdul was a young schoolboy at the time, and he was fleeing from the soldiers and was shot in the leg. And it basically, from that point on, his education was lost. But he's become a kind of a vocal advocate against the regime, and part of an international group called Jammeh to Justice, which hopes eventually to bring Jammeh to court. This gentleman here was part of a fake AIDS cure. Jammeh was very much into the dark arts. He believed he was a herbalist, and he set up a clinic to take people off of antiretroviral drugs and basically put them on his own personal remedies. And multiple people died because of the ineffectiveness of these kind of quack cures. And Lamin was someone that had HIV, but luckily enough he survived the program, but his wife died because of these fake cures. Other things that Jammeh did was witch hunts. He believed very much that there were kind of witches within communities, and he sent people out to pick up these so-called witches. And this is a portrait of a gentleman whose mother had been picked up allegedly for witchcraft, and died as a result of being forced to drink a concoction, sort of a truth serum as such. There was a lot of cases of sexual and gender-based violence. She was assaulted and gang raped by a group of Jammeh's security forces. But she's extremely brave, and she came to the TRRC and she spoke openly about what happened to her, which led to multiple other women coming forward. This was another gentleman who'd been taken in during protests and had been held within the National Intelligence Agency and beaten, tortured. And this is all these are just for the techie people out there. Again, I only work with natural lights, so we're just kind of working in with maybe just a reflector, and that's about it. And this gentleman had been caught up in some protests. He was completely innocent, and had been taken to the National Intelligence Agency, where he'd been beaten, had been injected with something that basically, still don't know to this day what it was, but something that paralyzed him, or temporarily paralyzed him. And he'd been a taxi driver, and when he was finally released after 3 months, he went to find his taxi, but it turned out that the National Intelligence Agency undercover guys had taken his taxi, had been using it, and basically destroyed it. But he was able to get it back home. And this is a photograph of his taxi just parked in the garage. It had been gathering dust because it was inoperable. So I felt it kind of poignant to make a picture with his taxi. It has a kind of a lot of layers of meaning there. She was another protester that had picked up and they'd poured hot plastic onto her chest. So that mark on her collarbone there is actually from when security services dripped hot plastic onto her to get confessions. This is one of the journalists who was forced out of the country. He'd been tortured and abused for allegedly writing articles against the president. And this is another one of the journalists as well that have been tortured, as too with this gentleman here as well, who now runs a newspaper. He's actually a member of parliament now as well. And this is a guy called Balo Kante, who was a political prisoner. He had attempted a coup back in the late 90s, and he'd been the longest serving prisoner. But as you can see, they really tortured him brutally over the years, including dropping plastic on him. They basically castrated him and cut off his nipples. So again, these people are all coming forward, and their testimonies are a part of the case to bring Jammeh and his cadre to justice. This just touches back on, links back to my migration work. So her father was with a group of West African migrants that were in the Gambia attempting to get to Europe, but they went off back in the Gambia in 2005, and there was about 55 migrants, mainly from Ghana. They were all picked up by the security forces, and within days, they'd all been slaughtered by Jammeh. They had literally been hacked to death. Jammeh, I think there was a belief that the migrants they kill all of them. And these are some of the children. I went to Ghana to photograph the never had the bodies. And I did say there was no survivors. That was incorrect. This is Martin Chire, sole survivor of the massacre. He was able to jump out the back of one of the pickup trucks, and he hid in the bush for a couple of days before he was lucky enough to actually get over the border into Senegal. And now he's an advocate to talk about what had happened. He was kind of a key witness to this slaughter of the migrants. And a number of people, victims themselves, and now become vocal opponents, I'd say, or they've become essential to the hunt to get Jammeh to Guinea, protected by another dictator called Obiang. But there is a huge international push, thanks to people coming forward. So the young lady in the picture, her name is Tufa Jallow, and she was a test which Jammeh would put on. He loved doing these beauty pageants, and he basically groomed her over about a 2-year period. Then wanted her to marry him, and when she was interested in doing, she wanted to continue her education, he was already married, etc. He basically had her lured to his palace and raped her there. So Tufa ended up leaving the country the following day without telling her family, because she was fearful if she spoke out at that point, she herself could be killed or her family could be targeted. So she snuck across the border to Senegal, and was eventually was able to get asylum in Canada, and now she has her own Tufa Foundation, which is working for the rights of women, especially around sexual and gender-based violence. And the final picture loops us back to New York. This is Nana Joan Dow, whose father was murdered by Yahya Jammeh. He was picked up across the border in Senegal, dragged back to Jammeh's palace and farm, and along with a colleague of his, they were according to witnesses, were basically hacked to death. And so Nana Jo is also someone that's, she set up an organization called ANAKED, which is the African Network for Extrajudicial Killings and Enforced Disappearances. And she is now, taken up the mantle and is fighting along with many other people to finally get Jammeh to justice. And I think we'll leave it there at New York. So thank you very much indeed for everyone for listening. I realize we've gone a little bit over time, but I really appreciate you taking the time to listen and look at the work.
Jason, I'm waiting for David to come back on.
Okay, so I'm just seeing all the messages on the side, and I realized my mouse might have been over some of the pictures and things. I'm
not
sure
sure
it didn't disturb people's viewing too much.
At this moment.
Okay.
David, are you there? There.
Yeah, hello. Sorry, I'm having some tough technical issues over here as well. So Nancy, thanks for jumping in. Jason, that was amazing. I mean, just incredible work and truly heartfelt stories about what that was like. And there's a couple of great questions that have been sent in. So I'm going to start with one from Lisa, and she writes, thank you for sharing your journey. You're capturing some poignant life moments. Can you share with us what was happening behind the camera and how you handle these intense encounters as a photographer? How did people react to you taking their photos, particularly the rescue shots? What was your internal dialogue witnessing these realities firsthand? And she then goes on to say that she also struggles with the fear of being seen as a tourist versus photographer, and how do you walk that line? I think also something I was going to ask you along those same lines is, with that first experience into Afghanistan, in terms of making those photographs under known circumstances where you were not allowed to, that must have been pretty terrifying too at that point. So I guess if you could talk about all that, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, Afghanistan was that was kind of a trial by fire for sure. We ended up getting arrested at the football stadium at the beginning of our journey into Kabul. This was 2000. So there was actually a football match between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so we were invited into the stadium, which was a kind of a notorious place that they did executions. So it was kind of a strange sort of spot for a football match. But we ended up, I sat with a group of young Talib soldiers, and they obviously hadn't heard the doctrine about the pictures were illegal, and they were pushing me to take pictures. And then another group came along, was called the Vice and Virtue, who were the religious police, and it became a fight between the Taliban soldiers and the Vice and Virtue police, trying to get my camera off of me, etc. And then we ended up getting bundled in a pickup truck and taken to the Vice and Virtue and trying to explain why we were taking pictures. And so that was it frightened the hell out of me. So much so that I got back to the hotel, and I turned the bathroom into a dark room, and I took all the as I was only shooting black and white, but I was able to buy some rolls of color film in the market, and I pulled the film out of the color canisters and put the exposed black and white film in the color canisters, thinking that if the Taliban ever did get hold of me for like the pictures of the three girls with the picture behind them, that the film would be destroyed, and that would be it. So I'm not sure it was a long way around of telling that, but yeah, it was very, very difficult working in Afghanistan. And once I'd got to, we did 2 weeks and we finally got to Herat on the west side. And there was a lovely Swedish lady from the UN. And I explained to her what had happened about the film previously. And she said, well, look, I'll put it in a bag and I'm flying back on a UN plane to Islamabad, so all your film will be protected. You can, you know, even if you get stopped again, you won't lose anything. So that was that part. There was multiple questions, I think, within Lisa's part there. So how do you dealing with photographing people? I think working on the rescue ship was extremely difficult. Emotionally, was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. I remember the first boat that we approached was absolutely silent. And I remember just pulling up then, I just burst into tears. I had tears rolling down my face behind the camera, because it was just so shocking to see a boat with 400 people on there, young people, kids, just sat there in the middle of the ocean. I mean, it was completely calm. It was a strange sight, but we found out the boat was taking on water and the guys who were packed underneath were trying to bail out water. So yeah, that if we hadn't got there within a few hours, the boat would have gone down and hundreds of people could have died. So, yeah, I'm not sure how to explain. I think, you know, at the time you just kind of get on with your job. I know it's probably what so many photographers say, but there was definitely times that you know, you have these very personal connections with people, especially with the Gambians. For me was, I can speak a little bit of Mandinka, which is one of the local languages, and it just sort of, you could see people's eyes light up. You know, I could give them some instructions in Mandinka in the middle of the sea, and suddenly there was like this human connection right there. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't imagine what that must have, you know, felt like, just witnessing that, and let's say thinking about what those possibilities might have turned into had the rescue boat not been there. Pretty
exactly. Yeah. I mean,
please go ahead.
Yeah, no, just I was, you know, we had this one incident when we were in the Aegean, when the small smuggler boat flipped over and we found all these people just in the darkness. And it was just when we started, at that point, we had a TV crew joining us. And at that point, everyone sort of put the cameras down and we're trying to pull people onto our little rescue craft. And I think it was one of the most awful things I've ever witnessed in my life was these 3 young babies that got pulled aboard, and the doctors couldn't resuscitate them. And you're just seeing the mother and the father just suddenly realize it was one family lost 2 children, and there was a woman who'd lost the daughter. And that was just tragic. And when we brought the bodies onto the deck, and we had them sort of covered up with blankets, and the parents at that point, I don't think they realized that the children were actually dead. And it was, I mean, it was just, these people, in a split second, their lives had completely changed. They'd been fleeing from Syria. So not only they'd been fleeing a war, and then suddenly at the last minute, the chance of, maybe finding some sort of safety, that everything was just destroyed within a second and within a few meters of reaching the land. So.
That's incredible. You just said something that I think is often a conversation with our photography students, and I would imagine other photography students around, which is, at what point do you put down the camera and take some action to help or do something different? As you just mentioned, you guys all put down your cameras and we're pulling people out of the water. I know that's sort of a common question of, well, how do you make that decision? How do you walk that line of becoming a participant versus being a viewer, so to speak? Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what's your experience been with that?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I mean, the safety of others comes before the picture, without a question. I mean, there was a point where I worked with an incredible team of professional rescuers, and I'm not trained as a rescuer in any way, shape, or form. But there was times when you just needed another set of hands, and if, how can I put it? I would keep shooting as long as I could see that I wasn't needed in any way. But yeah, there were times when you did have to put it down and help another human being. The picture, the sake of getting the picture just definitely wasn't worth it. And I know there's probably a lot of people over the years, photojournalists, saying, well, you shouldn't get involved and you shouldn't, you should not participate in any way. But I think as human beings, that's first and foremost. I could not step aside and let something happen in front of me for the sake of a picture, for sure. I could never live with myself.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, I think. So you talked a little bit early on about sort of funding by advanced sales of prints and stuff like that. How are you doing that now? Like, what's your process now that there's all these new platforms out there to try and raise funding for projects like what you're working on? What's working for you?
For example, the work we've been doing with the victims, we call it the victims and resistors. That sort of funding's come in many different ways from that. We were kind of self-funding part of it. We're doing, I would say, commercial jobs, but things like, say, for the United Nations or for NGOs or for kind of editorial clients. And then we were very fortunate. The British Embassy here in Gambia was supporting kind of this truth and reconciliation process. And they had some money which became available to us, which was an absolute lifeline. So it meant we could use it to do exhibitions, and the exhibitions have been used within the Gambia as a tool of advocacy and a way of just bringing the stories into the general public. So yeah, grants have definitely been the more recent way that we've been able to go forward. We haven't done any. Helen's just right here. We haven't done any other. That was, I think, the river was the last time we actually did a kind of a print sale for a project. So yes, it's been a few years since the river project that we did a kind of a crowdfunding as such. So yeah, either from our own pockets, from commercial jobs, or the grants have been very helpful as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. I can imagine. I think that's again often a conversation from students of how do you make projects like that sort of come to life. So
yeah,
good,
absolutely.
Good process.
Yeah, I don't have a trust fund, by the way. So
yeah, be nice, right? But
yeah, absolutely.
There's another great question here too, and you've touched on some of this a little bit, but the question is, what's the most difficult thing for you as a photographer? What really are the big challenges that you face?
Figuring out when to stop. It's like if I've got a project, it's like the project with the victims and resistors. It feels like I keep finding, we keep thinking about new things, how we can add to the story and find ways of, kind of, again, getting it into the public arena. Getting the right people to see the work is really important. I'm not very good about trying to figure, when to. I think things do come to a natural end. So, for example, the black and white portraits I did over kind of a 10-year period. I think there was sort of a natural end to that. I don't know, it just felt like, I'm not saying I ran out of steam on it, but I didn't feel I was adding anything to it. But sometimes it can take a long time. So I think to me that's my personal challenge of when does a project actually end?
Yeah.
I think that's
interesting. I mean, two of the projects you showed. Sorry,
I'm talking over you.
Two of those projects almost had a. That's all right. Two of the projects you shared, the river and the walking project, they almost have a natural start and ending to them, because there's a journey and a destination with that. But I could see how challenging it would be for other ones. How do you say that? How do you know that you're finished? Good challenge.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. So, Jason, we are at about 1:30.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I think we've answered all the questions. There is one more here about if you have an interpreter with you all the time as you're traveling around.
Yeah, it's for us. It's somewhere wherever I'm traveling, I think it's absolutely imperative to have someone that, whether they're actually a translator or maybe, like I'd say, even like a cultural translator as such. So the Gambia is quite good because a lot of people speak English here, but we do nearly always work with a kind of a fixer, translator, or we've got a great friend of ours here who's a taxi driver, and he's just like kind of is with us on so many projects. So I think just having someone that can understand the sort of the cultural minutiae and try and translate that to us is just as important as actually having someone that can translate a language.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Great. So Jason, I think we are about out of time, but I really want to thank you so much for your time today, and
thank you for
sharing the work and for everything that you're doing. Really, it's important stuff, and I think especially this project we're working on currently, just to bring light to the injustices that happened in the Gambia. It's amazing. So thank you again.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for giving me the space to do it, and big thanks to Nancy for
Jason,
making it all happen. So really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, great. And everybody, thank you for being here and for sending in your questions. And we will see you all again soon.